Imagine waking up. It is 2:21 scene a.m., and you hear the sound of three heavy, deliberate knocks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but it's not on your front door. It's not on your bedroom door. It is on the ceiling directly above your bed.
Right where you're sleeping.
Exactly. And you happen to know for an absolute fact that you are in a building where the floor above you has been totally abandoned for years.
That is, yeah, that's the ultimate nightmare scenario right there.
It really is
Yeah.
because usually when we talk about the physical spaces we inhabit, right, like our apartments, our homes, even, I don't know, temporary spaces like hotel rooms, we operate under this very strict unconscious assumption of safety.
Right. We trust the geometry of the space.
Exactly. We believe a wall is a wall, a locked door is a locked door. They are these solid, inert, protective barriers between us and just the absolute chaos of the outside world.
Yeah, we expect architecture to just be a passive container for our lives.
Right. But today, we are unpacking a narrative that completely shatters that assumption. We are doing a deep dive into a case study of a space that doesn't just hold you, it doesn't just trap you, it like actively digests you.
It is the absolute definition of architectural dread. I mean, it is compounded by this profound psychological entrapment.
Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are examining an incredibly unsettling piece of source material titled The Occupant of Room 13.
Yes, and I am so excited to get into this one.
Me too. And I want to set the baseline right now for you listening. If you approach this as a traditional ghost story, the kind with a tragic spirit looking for unfinished business, or like a jump scare poltergeist moving chairs around.
Right, the usual tropes.
Yeah, if you expect that, you are going to entirely miss the mechanics of what makes this narrative so incredibly dangerous.
Oh, completely. It subverts almost every single trope of the haunted house genre. Because what this source provides is this terrifyingly meticulous masterclass in psychological escalation.
It basically takes the very concept of shelter and weaponizes it against the human mind. So we have a protagonist, right? A highly vulnerable university student who moves into this decaying, almost rotting hostel.
And it's right in the middle of a relentless monsoon season, which is key.
Yes, the timing is terrible, and the premise centers around this single chilling directive given by the terrified owner of the building. He says, never knock on room 13, even if someone knocks back.
Which immediately establishes this perimeter of forbidden space.
Yeah.
That rule, that addendum, even if someone knocks back, I mean, it implies a predetermined interactivity.
It's an invitation almost.
Exactly. It tells the listener and the protagonist that the space isn't just haunted, it's baiting you. It is actively seeking engagement.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we need to start with the architecture of that vulnerability. The physical environment here is doing a massive amount of psychological heavy lifting long before we get to anything even slightly supernatural.
Oh, absolutely. The setting is everything.
Yeah, right. So if you are this protagonist, you are a university student. And that demographic alone carries a tremendous amount of inherent vulnerability.
Yeah, you're likely chronically stressed.
Chronically stressed, carrying a baseline of sleep deprivation from academic pressure, and crucially, you are strapped for cash.
Broke.
Totally broke. And the source material is very deliberate in mentioning that the rent for this room was cheap. Too cheap. We cannot overlook that detail.
No, we can't. Because this trap specifically preys on socioeconomic desperation.
Yeah. You walk into this old 3-story building, you smell the damp mold, you see the water damage everywhere, you hear these super creepy warnings about the 3rd floor, and you ignore all of those massive red flags because you literally cannot afford to care.
I mean, that financial constraint is the invisible lock on the front door.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Well, we often analyze horror through the lens of agency, right? Like, people always yell at the screen, why doesn't the protagonist just leave?
Right, just pack your bags and go.
Exactly. When you view it through the lens of economic reality, the survival instinct to flee a dangerous or uncomfortable situation is completely overridden by the practical, terrifying reality that you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, the street is not a viable alternative.
It's not. And the environment amplifies this entrapment exponentially.
Right.
The narrative is set during the monsoon season. And this is just brilliant environmental storytelling.
Because a monsoon isn't just like a heavy rainstorm.
Right. It is a multi-day, sometimes multi-week deluge. It floods streets, it knocks out infrastructure, and it creates this deafening, constant wall of white noise.
Yeah, the rain is just relentless.
So the dangerous weather outside creates a perfect environmental trap.
Yeah.
The protagonist is physically pinned in place, just forced to remain confined inside this decaying structure.
I was actually trying to find a way to really visualize this specific type of claustrophobia, and the best analogy I could come up with is a decaying Cold War era submarine.
Oh, I like that.
Right, so the monsoon raging outside, that is the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. It is deadly, it is ubiquitous, and it makes the damp, claustrophobic interior of the submarine feel like your only viable safe haven.
Even though the hull is visibly failing.
Exactly. It's groaning under the pressure. You are stuck in your little bunk on the second floor in room 12. And that third floor where room 13 sits, that's the uncharted, dark sector of the submarine.
The restricted zone.
Yeah, it's the flooded compartment that the rest of the crew intuitively avoids. It's the place where the radiation leaks are highest, but nobody talks about it because acknowledging it makes the reality of the danger too present.
Right. And to push that submarine analogy even further, think about what happens to the human mind in a submarine.
You go a little crazy, I'd imagine.
You experience extreme sensory deprivation coupled with acute claustrophobia. The hostel is failing as a shelter, but the outside world is temporarily uninhabitable. So the protagonist is forced to endure the internal decay.
They're just stuck in limbo.
Yes, they are trapped in a liminal space. A hostel is transient by design. It's not a home, it's a temporary holding area.
Yeah, you're just passing through.
And liminal spaces are inherently unsettling because they lack the permanent markers of human habitation and identity. They're a transit point.
Right, there's no warmth to it.
Exactly. And it's within this specific pressure cooker of isolation, liminality, and environmental entrapment that the auditory invasion actually begins. The physical environment simply sets the stage, but it is the manipulation of sound that breaches the protagonist's psychological defenses.
And the escalation of those sounds is so insidious. Like, it doesn't start with a demonic roar or a sudden violent crash.
No, it's subtle.
It's a slow, methodical drip. The source details that every single night at roughly 2:16 a.m., the protagonist begins hearing footsteps overhead. But not just normal walking. Slow, heavy, dragging footsteps. Pacing back and forth in a room on the third floor that the owner explicitly stated was completely empty.
What's fascinating here is how the human mind handles an anomaly that directly threatens its foundational sense of safety.
Right, because your brain kind of goes into denial.
It does. The brain has this incredible capacity for rationalization. When you are confronted with sensory input that suggests a supernatural or, lethal threat, the mind instantly attempts to categorize it as mundane.
Yeah, it has to.
The protagonist initially ignores the dragging footsteps.
Yeah.
Their internal monologue just dismisses it as the reality of an old building. They tell themselves, oh, it's just the pipe settling. It's probably just large rats in the crawl space.
Right?
This is a documented cognitive bias. We instinctively write off terrifying anomalies to protect our fragile sanity.
Because the alternative is just too much to handle.
Exactly. I mean, a rat in the ceiling is gross, it's unhygienic, but it operates firmly within the known laws of biology and physics.
Yeah, you understand a rat.
Right. A heady, bipedal, dragging footstep from a locked, empty room. That threatens to completely shatter your worldview, so your brain forcefully chooses the rat.
It's a biological survival mechanism, because if you actually acknowledge the footstep for what it truly is, an impossible threat, you trigger a massive adrenaline dump.
You go straight into fight or flight.
Exactly. And if you are in fight or flight, you cannot sleep. If you can't sleep, your cognitive functions degrade, you fail your university exams, and your life falls apart.
The cascading consequences.
Right. So the brain literally lies to you so you can rest. But the entity in room 13 doesn't allow the protagonist to maintain that comfortable illusion.
No, it forces the issue.
It does. The ambient background noise deliberately shifts into a highly targeted intrusion. It escalates from random dragging footsteps to 3 distinct sharp knocks. Knock, knock, knock.
The terrifying part is the spatial placement of those knocks.
Yes. It's not knocking on the floorboards in the center of the room. It's directly above the protagonist's bed. Every single night. At exactly the same time.
That precision is what elevates this from an unsettling environmental quirk to an active, predatory horror.
Because rats don't knock.
Rats do not operate on a strict 24-hour timetable, and the thermal expansion and contraction of settling pipes do not produce rhythmic knocking in sets of 3, perfectly localized over a sleeping person's head.
It's too perfect.
Exactly. The phenomenon is displaying intent. It is displaying intelligence. It is demanding acknowledgement, effectively saying, I know exactly where you are, and I am not a pipe.
Ugh, that gives me chills. And this unavoidable intelligence is what finally forces the protagonist to break their silence and seek out the hostile owner for an explanation.
Which is a huge turning point.
It is, and we have to talk about that interaction with the owner because honestly, his reaction is arguably scarier than the knocking itself.
Oh, absolutely.
The source notes that the moment the protagonist casually mentions room 13 and the noises, the owner's entire demeanor shifts.
He doesn't brush it off.
No. He isn't annoyed that a tenant is complaining. He doesn't offer to go up and check the pipes. He is deeply, viscerally terrified.
Yeah.
He drops his voice and quietly warns the protagonist, if you hear knocking, do not answer it. And then he drops this massive arbitrary rule. He says, never go upstairs after 2 a.m.
The profound horror in that specific interaction lies in the realization of systemic powerlessness.
Yeah, because he's supposed to be the one in charge.
Exactly. In the microsociety of an apartment building or a hostel, the landlord or the owner functions as the ultimate authority figure.
Yep.
They hold the keys, they maintain the structure, they represent order and safety.
Right.
When that authority figure is visibly terrified, when they offer absolutely no practical solution, no promise of intervention, but only avoidance and these arbitrary superstitious rules, the protagonist's psychological isolation deepens immensely.
Because if the guy in charge is scared, you are completely on your own.
Exactly. The owner is essentially admitting that he has ceded territory to whatever occupies the third floor. He's entirely complicit through his inaction. He is sacrificing his tenants to maintain an uneasy truce with the anomaly.
But wait, I need to look closely at the timeline of events here because there is a massive, sinister shift that happens immediately after this conversation with the owner.
Yes, the escalation accelerates.
Right. So the protagonist goes back to their room. They kind of laugh it off, thinking, oh, the owner is just eccentric or he's trying to haze the new kid.
Again, rationalizing.
Exactly. They stay awake, watching the clock on their phone. 2.1 scene a.m. Silence. 2.1 scene a.m. Knock. 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 But the sound has migrated.
It's moved.
It's no longer on the ceiling. It has moved down an entire floor. It is now right outside the protagonist's bedroom door, literally vibrating the wood of the doorframe.
Which is just terrifying.
And then a voice whispers through the crack at the bottom of the door. It says, wrong room.
Oh, God.
Now, did the mere act of speaking about room 13 to the owner act as some sort of unintentional invitation? Because it feels like the entity was just a localized environmental hazard until the protagonist voiced their awareness, and the moment they named it, the entity locked onto them.
That is a highly astute reading of the sequence of events. In nearly all folkloric, supernatural, and even psychological frameworks, naming a thing or giving voice to your awareness of it provides it with a vector into your reality.
Like speaking it into existence.
Exactly. It's the concept of the summoning by name. By bringing room 13 out of the realm of ignored, rationalized ambient noise and into spoken, acknowledged conversation, the protagonist crossed a crucial, invisible boundary of engagement.
They let it know they were listening.
They signaled to the entity that the bait had been noticed, and the entity responds symmetrically. Since the protagonist crossed a boundary of awareness, the entity crosses a physical boundary. It moves its manifestation from the quarantined third floor down to the second, right up to the protagonist's personal threshold.
And right as that immediate physical threat is literally vibrating the door to their room, the narrative drops this perfect, incredibly modern detail. The protagonist instinctively grabs their phone to call for help. And of course, there is zero signal. And the battery, which was likely charged, instantly drops to 1% and the screen dies. It is the ultimate severing of the modern umbilical cord to the outside world.
Which is just a brilliant evolution of the isolation theme.
It's so relatable, too. That panic of a dead phone.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The tech failure isn't just a convenient plot contrivance to stop them from calling the police. It is the exact moment the protagonist's brain realizes there is no external savior.
Nobody's coming.
Nobody. The hostel is physically cut off by the floodwaters of the monsoon. They are socially cut off by the landlord's cowardly complicity. And now they are technologically cut off by the sudden battery drain.
They are completely boxed in.
When the brain fundamentally registers that no one is coming, it triggers an absolute primal fight-or-flight response. The modern safety net has completely evaporated, leaving them entirely alone with an apex predator.
Which brings us to the moment that always makes people scream at their screens or books. The communication lines are severed. The shadow is pacing back and forth under the doorframe. The protagonist watches the hallway lights flickering through the crack.
The tension is just peaking here.
Right. And they know, logically, they should stay inside. The source text even features a rare moment of retrospective narration where the protagonist says, I know that now.
Yeah.
But they don't stay inside. They turn the handle and they open the door. And I really struggle to buy the cognitive overload argument here that a lot of critics use.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Because if I am terrified by a ghostly knock and a whispering voice, my instinct is to barricade the door with my dresser, grab a heavy lamp, and hide under the covers.
You turtle up.
Exactly. I am not opening the door and following wet footprints into the dark. Isn't this just a classic, frustrating horror movie protagonist making a demonstrably dumb choice to advance the plot?
Well, it's easy to view it that way from the safety of armchair analysis. But if we actually examine the neurology of acute sleep deprivation combined with sustained terror, the protagonist's actions become terrifyingly rational.
Really? How so?
We have to discuss what the medical field calls amygdala hijack, combined with ambiguity aversion. Remember, this student hasn't slept properly in days.
Right, the 2417 a.m. wake-up calls.
Exactly. Their REM cycles have been violently interrupted repeatedly. When sleep deprivation compounds, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning, risk assessment, and impulse control, it functionally powers down.
It just goes offline.
Essentially, yes. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, goes into absolute overdrive.
So they're operating entirely on instinct. But why is the instinct to approach the danger? That's what I don't get.
Because of ambiguity aversion. The human brain is hardwired to process known threats much more efficiently than unknown threats. We prefer a guaranteed negative outcome over a prolonged, ambiguous outcome.
Wait, really? We'd rather know we're in danger than wonder if we are.
Absolutely. The unknown threat pacing behind the thin wooden door has become more psychologically taxing, more energetically expensive for the brain to process than actually facing the threat.
Oh, wow.
The protagonist doesn't open the door out of cinematic bravery or stupidity. They open it out of a desperate, primal need to resolve the ambiguity. They just want the unbearable, grinding anxiety of the unknown to stop, even if the answer is horrific.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you're saying it's not bravery, it's just the brain demanding a resolution to the tension.
Yes.
That completely changes how I view the scene. It's like, think about getting a highly sophisticated, malicious phishing email late at night.
Okay.
You are exhausted, the email says your bank account is frozen, or there's a massive suspicious charge on your credit card.
Panic sets in.
Right. And the rational, well-rested part of your brain during the middle of the day would easily spot the fake sender address or the slight typos in the logo. But at 2 a.m., your exhaustion, combined with that artificial sense of extreme urgency, completely overrides your common sense.
You're not thinking straight.
Exactly. You just want that sudden spike of financial anxiety to stop, so you click the link to resolve it.
To push that digital analogy further, the wet footprints in the hallway are the malicious link.
Oh, that's perfect.
When the protagonist opens the door, they don't find a monster waiting to pounce. The hallway is empty, freezing cold, and smells like damp earth. But there, on the floorboards, are bare, wet footprints dripping with monsoon water, leading away from their door, toward the stairs, and directly up to the third floor.
Leading them right up.
Yes. Those footprints are breadcrumbs. They are meticulously laid out data points designed to lead a compromised, exhausted mind right into the center of the trap.
It's so calculated.
The entity understands human psychology better than the human does. It knows that a direct assault might cause the prey to barricade the door, exactly as you suggested earlier. But a trail of evidence, that triggers curiosity. That promises the resolution the brain is desperately craving.
And the protagonist follows that malicious link. They follow the dripping water, moving out of the relative safety of the second floor and up into the darker, abandoned section of the building.
Into the unknown.
Right. The working lights are completely gone up here, replaced only by whatever dim moonlight can filter through the monsoon rain outside. They reach the end of the long hallway. The wet footprints stop right in front of the door to room 13, which is sitting just slightly cracked open.
Just enough to invite them in.
Yeah. And from inside that dark room, they hear something so viscerally awful. Heavy, slow, wet breathing. And then the knocking starts again, but it's not coming from the door. It's not coming from the floor. It is coming from inside the walls of the room, like someone is trapped behind the drywall, frantically trying to get out.
This specific auditory cue, the knocking, originating from within the structural boundaries of the architecture itself, is our first concrete indication that the room is not merely a container for a haunting.
It's part of the haunting.
Exactly. It is not a stage where a ghost performs. The room itself is anatomically involved in the phenomenon. When the protagonist pushes that cracked door open, they cross the final irreversible threshold.
And the visual inside room 13 is so stark, almost minimalist, which I think makes it even more terrifying. There's no gothic furniture, no blood on the walls.
It's empty.
There's just a single bare mattress, and sitting on that mattress is a figure facing away from the door, staring at the blank wall. It has long, dark, wet hair plastered to its back, and its shoulders are twitching rhythmically with that heavy breathing.
Such a disturbing image.
And the protagonist, in what has to be the most tragically human, desperate response possible to this nightmare scenario, just stands in the doorway and softly whispers, "Hello."
And that single whispered greeting is the trigger mechanism of the trap.
Just that one word.
The instant the word leaves their mouth, the knocking inside the walls stops dead. The door behind them violently slams shut, severing them from the hallway.
Oh, man.
The ambient light dies. And as their eyes adjust to the gloom, the protagonist is finally forced to truly look at the walls of the room. This is where the source text delivers its most potent, devastating piece of environmental storytelling.
The walls. We have to talk about the walls because there is no helpful narrator explaining the tragic history of this hostel. There is no convenient old newspaper clipping that the protagonist finds in a dusty library explaining who died here in 1982.
Right, none of the standard exposition dumps.
Exactly. The history of this building, the true nature of the trap, is written directly onto the walls by the people who were consumed by it. The walls are covered entirely in thousands upon thousands of deep, frantic scratches.
Thousands of them.
And as the protagonist looks closer, they realize the scratches aren't just random gouges. They are words, phrases repeated over and over in different handwriting, etched into the plaster. Don't let it look at you. Don't answer the knocking. And the most prominent one, it copies voices.
This is a phenomenal example of what historians call epigraphy.
Epigraphy.
Yes, the study of inscriptions. But here, it's weaponized for horror. The history of this space is quite literally an archive of its past victims.
Wow. An archive of victims.
The phrase thousands of scratches implies a terrifying timeline. It implies decades of history, decades of vulnerable, financially desperate, isolated students being lured up to this top floor, following the exact same wet footprints and falling for the exact same trap.
It's just an endless cycle.
And if we analyze the psychology of the scratches, you have to consider the profound, unimaginable desperation required to gouge words into solid plaster with your fingernails, or whatever small objects you have in your pockets.
Your hands would be bleeding.
Yes, these aren't just acts of vandalism or graffiti. They are desperate, agonizing acts of communication from people who had already realized they were doomed. They were trying to reach across time through the medium of the architecture to save the next person, to save our protagonist.
But the warning is useless because it can only be read once you are already locked inside the trap.
Exactly. It's too late.
And here is a mechanical question about this scene that completely messed with my head when I was reading through the source materials, and it kind of shifts the entire paradigm of the story.
Okay.
If the tall, thin figure with the wet hair was sitting on the bed in the center of the room, facing away from the protagonist who was doing the frantic knocking from inside the walls just moments before.
Yes. That is the pivotal, horrifying realization regarding the nature of the space.
Right. It implies that the room itself is a collective gestalt entity. It is a purgatory. The physical entity sitting on the bed isn't acting alone. It isn't a solitary ghost.
No, it's much more than that.
It is supported by, or perhaps is merely an external appendage of, the trapped consciousnesses of every single previous tenant who died in that room. The people who made those scratches are still there, trapped inside the drywall, making the knocking sounds to lure the next victim.
Exactly. The scratched warnings tell the protagonist what the entity on the bed does. It copies voices. But the physical interaction that immediately follows reveals the horrifying why.
The motivation.
Right. The entity stands up from the mattress. The text describes it as too tall, too thin, suggesting an anatomy that is only an approximation of humanity.
Like it's wearing a suit that doesn't fit right.
Precisely. And without turning around to face the protagonist, it speaks. It says, "You answered."
And then it turns around. The face is still obscured by that heavy, wet hair, but beneath the pale skin of its face and neck, there is violent movement.
This visual is just sickening.
It really is. Multiple human faces, different sizes, different bone structures, are pushing outward from the inside, straining against the surface of the entity's skin like they are trying to break through latex. And then the entity speaks again, but this time it uses the protagonist's own perfectly copied, uniquely modulated voice. It whispers the exact same phrase it used out in the hallway. Wrong room.
We need to deeply analyze the mechanism of this vocal mimicry, because it is the absolute core of the psychological horror in this narrative.
Yeah, why the voice?
Why does the entity use the protagonist's voice? By perfectly stealing and replicating the protagonist's voice, the entity is executing the ultimate violation of the philosophy of self.
Okay, unpacking the philosophy of self.
Right. This isn't just a supernatural parlor trick designed to be spooky. It is the active, observable beginning of the assimilation process.
Assimilation. That's a terrifying word for it, but it's exactly what is happening. Can you break down why the voice specifically is so important to human identity?
Certainly. If we look at human neurology and psychology, our voice is our primary external tool for expressing our unique identity, our agency, and our presence in the physical world.
It's how we say, I am here.
Exactly. It is how we assert that we exist.
Yeah.
Furthermore, we hear our own voice differently than anyone else does due to bone conduction in our skulls. It is an incredibly intimate sensory experience.
Oh, true. Like when you hear a recording of yourself and it sounds weird.
Right, because you are used to the internal resonance. When the entity speaks with the protagonist's perfect inflection, cadence, and tone, it induces massive neurological dissonance.
Because it sounds like the internal version.
Yes, it is demonstrating that it hasn't just copied a sound wave.
Oh, yeah.
It has already breached their innermost psychological self. It is stripping the victim of their individuality, preparing to render them down into just another one of those anonymous, writhing faces trapped beneath its skin.
That is horrifying.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the macro theme of isolation we discussed in the first act, think about how cruel this is. In a lonely, decaying hostel, cut off from the world by a flood, the sound of a human voice, even your own, is usually the only comfort you have. The entity takes the single most comforting thing possible, the proof of your own existence, and twists it into an offensive weapon against you.
I have to point out how elegantly this subverts the traditional expectations of a haunting. Usually a ghost is a singular, distinct spirit. It's the angry victim of a tragic murder or a sorrowful figure tied to a specific historical trauma, retaining its human identity.
Right, Casper the Friendly Ghost or the Woman in Black.
Yeah, but this occupant, this is an amalgamation. It's a bioaccumulator of trauma. It wears the collective grief, terror, and identities of everyone who has ever made the mistake of opening that door.
A literal collection of souls.
Those faces pushing out from beneath the skin aren't just scary CGI-style imagery. They are the previous tenants. They are the university students from 1990, the desperate travelers from 2005. They are the people who scratched the warnings into the plaster. The entity is a horrific, localized sinkhole of stolen identities.
And once the conceptual identity is compromised by the theft of the voice, the physical reality of the room immediately follows suit.
Things get crazy here.
The vocal theft acts as the catalyst that triggers the final catastrophic breakdown of the room's Euclidean geometry and physical boundaries.
This is where the narrative shifts gears from psychological, creeping dread into pure, surreal, almost Lovecraftian nightmare logic. The source text describes the room essentially coming alive. The knocking returns, but it's no longer just a lure from behind the walls. It's everywhere. Inside the walls, above in the ceiling, below the floorboards, dozens and dozens of separate, distinct knocks. And they aren't chaotic. They're using different rhythms, different speeds, responding to one another.
The protagonist makes a terrifying, lucid observation amidst the panic here. They realize the knocking isn't random haunting noise.
Right.
One rapid knock from the left wall is immediately answered by 2 slow knocks from the ceiling, which is then followed by 3 scraping knocks from beneath the floorboards. It is a complex communication network.
It's a hive mind. It's swarm intelligence.
Precisely. Think of quorum sensing in bacteria, where individual cells communicate to coordinate a unified, massive attack once they reach a certain density.
Oh, wow.
The room is operating on that principle. This realization completely shatters the protagonist's illusion that they are fighting a single, tangible monster standing in front of them. They are surrounded by an organized, predatory ecosystem that is actively coordinating their capture.
It's a trap within a trap.
And as this invisible communication accelerates, The physical laws of the room simply dissolve.
If we compare the architecture to a computer system, it's like the room is a digital simulation that is suddenly running completely out of RAM.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it.
The rendering engine is failing because the room is focusing all of its processing power on assimilating the protagonist's mind. The hard-coded physics start glitching, faded floral wallpaper starts breathing.
Breathing, the detail is so gross.
And I don't mean fluttering in a draft from a window. It is expanding and contracting, inhaling and exhaling like lung tissue. Human-sized, three-dimensional shapes start crawling underneath the wallpaper, dragging themselves through the solid plaster of the building.
Just warping the architecture.
And then a hand pushes through the wallpaper, not punching a hole in the drywall, passing through it. The source specifically says it was like the wall was soft, like warm wax. Pale fingers, slick with wet skin, bent in completely unnatural, broken directions, reaching into the room.
The dissolution of the room's physical state perfectly mirrors the dissolution of the protagonist's rational mind.
They're breaking down together.
The solid protective barriers of the architecture, the very concept of shelter we discussed at the beginning, have become fluid, organic, and highly permeable.
It's not a shelter anymore.
The shelter has revealed itself as a trap, and now the trap is actively, physically closing in. The walls bulge outward, pregnant with the shapes of the previous victims trying to escape, or perhaps trying to pull the protagonist in to share their misery.
Oh, they definitely want company.
Naturally, when the protagonist desperately turns and yanks on the brass door handle, the door is fused shut.
So what does this all actually mean in practice? When you look at the mechanics of this climax, I can't help but go back to a biological analogy. The room is behaving exactly, step by step, like the stomach of a Venus flytrap.
I like that. Expand on the biological mechanics of that analogy.
Okay, think about how a Venus flytrap operates. It doesn't hunt, it doesn't chase, it lures, it waits for the prey to come to it.
Passive hunting.
Right. The initial rhythmic knocking at 2:17 a.m. for all those nights, that was the sweet nectar on the edge of the leaf. It was the bait designed to draw the prey out of safety.
Yes.
The wet footprints in the hallway were the pheromone trail. When the protagonist finally stepped inside room 13 and whispered that fatal hello, they essentially brushed against the microscopic trigger hairs inside the plant.
To the off the reaction.
The door slamming shut behind them was the two halves of the leaf snapping closed, sealing the prey inside. And now, the breathing lung-like walls, the plaster becoming soft like wax, the dozens of pale hands reaching out and physically grabbing the protagonist's clothes.
Well, digestion.
Exactly. That is the digestion process beginning. The room is secreting its enzymes. The architectural boundaries breaking down are the digestive acids going to work on the protagonist's reality. The room isn't haunted by a monster. The room is the digestive tract of a macroorganism.
That is a deeply unsettling, yet structurally perfect reading of the text. It reframes everything.
It changes the whole scale of the threat.
It does. The tall entity with the many faces standing on the bed is perhaps just a specialized lure. It's the glowing esca of an anglerfish, a biological puppet designed to keep the prey distracted and focused on a single point, while the massive, unseen environment around them prepares to consume them.
The anglerfish, yes.
And the entity practically confirms this trapped, digestive state. As the room is literally breaking apart, as the ceiling begins pounding like giant rhythmic fists, raining plaster dust down on them, the figure on the bed laughs.
Oh, God.
But it laughs using the protagonist's stolen voice. It tilts its head and says, "You opened it. Now they can hear you."
And on that cue, the faces shifting beneath the entity's skin all open their eyes simultaneously. Dozens of mismatched eyes looking directly at the protagonist.
Terrifying.
And every single mouth beneath the skin stretches open and whispers the exact same word in unison. Stay.
A collective, desperate demand from the already consumed. They want company in their purgatory.
Yeah.
They want to dilute their own suffering by adding another soul to the Gestalt.
Misery loves company.
Literally. And as the pale hands burst from the soft, waxy walls and physically grab the protagonist's arms and legs, dragging them toward the drywall, the source delivers its final, most devastating psychological blow.
The ultimate twist of the knife. As they are being pulled into the wall, the protagonist opens their mouth and screams. A full, primal scream of absolute terror. And the very moment they scream, everything instantly stops.
Complete deafening silence. The chaos vanishes in a microsecond. The hands let go. The knocking ceases.
The tall figure on the bed tilts its head, almost curiously, staring at the protagonist, and it whispers a line that just completely ruins me every time I read it. It says, "That wasn't your voice."
Let's unpack the terrifying existential implications of that single line.
Please do.
Up until this exact moment, the protagonists believed they were in a physical struggle. They believed they were fighting for their life, fighting to break free of the hands and escape the room.
Right, a fight for physical survival.
But that calm statement that wasn't your voice reveals that the battle was already over before the physical attack even began.
Right, the physical collapse of the room, the grabbing hands, it was all just a distraction, a smokescreen.
Exactly. The psychological collapse, the actual consumption of the protagonist, was already complete. When the entity stole the protagonist's voice earlier to say wrong room, the protagonist and the reader assumed it was just mimicry.
Like a parrot.
But it wasn't mimicry. It was actual, irreversible theft. In the moment of ultimate primal terror, when the protagonist opened their mouth to scream, which is the most raw, unfiltered biological expression of a person's authentic self, what came out of their throat was the voice of a stranger.
They didn't even realize they'd lost it.
Possibly the voice of the entity, or one of the previous victims. They had already been completely hollowed out.
Right.
Their identity had been successfully extracted and replaced. They were screaming, but the voice echoing in the room belonged to the collective. They experienced a complete, forced ego death.
It is so incredibly bleak. The lights go completely out, pitching the room into absolute darkness. The protagonist, standing frozen, hears wet breathing very close all around them in the dark, pressing in on them.
Total sensory deprivation again.
And then dozens of voices, all speaking simultaneously from inside the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, and every single voice is using the protagonist's stolen voice. The walls echo with their own sound, saying, "Room 13 is occupied now."
Jilling.
And then the source text ends with this final crushing detail. The rhythm returns. Knock, knock, knock. But the sound isn't out in the hallway anymore. It's not in the ceiling or inside the walls.
It's moved again.
The protagonist feels the vibration. The knocking is coming from inside the protagonist's own chest.
The physical captivity has seamlessly, flawlessly transitioned into internal spiritual captivity. The architectural boundaries between the self and the room no longer exist.
They are one and the same now.
The protagonist hasn't just been trapped in room 13, they have been successfully assimilated by it. They've literally become room 13. The terrifying anomaly that they observed from the outside, the knocking that kept them awake, is now the actual heartbeat of their new, horrific, collective existence.
They are the trap.
They are now part of the trap, waiting to lure the next desperate student who moves into room 12.
And the final text we get, flashing on the screen at the end of the source material, is a simple, brutal thesis statement. It reads, "Some doors are meant to stay closed."
It's the perfect summary.
It highlights such a profound, tragic irony. The protagonist was lonely, they were exhausted, and they were desperate for an answer to the terrifying ambiguity in the dark. They just wanted to resolve the tension so they could feel safe again.
A very human desire.
And that incredibly human, deeply understandable need for resolution, for connection, for understanding their environment is exactly the biological mechanism the room exploited to consume them.
It's a remarkably sobering examination of how human vulnerability, whether economic, emotional, or physiological, can be ruthlessly exploited, not just by malicious people, but by the very spaces we inhabit, the architecture we trust, and the unknown anomalies we arrogantly believe we can investigate and understand.
We think we can solve everything.
We do. And it teaches us that sometimes curiosity isn't a virtue, it's a fatal flaw.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and synthesize the incredible journey we've just been on.
It's been a lot.
It really has. We started in a dilapidated, monsoon-soaked hostel, examining how cheap rent, liminal architecture, and severe environmental conditions created the absolute perfect storm to isolate a vulnerable student.
The architecture of vulnerability.
We analyzed the brilliant psychological escalation of a simple rhythmic knock at 2:17 a.m. and how our desperate evolutionary attempts to rationalize terror into mundane events often blind us to the very real danger right above our heads.
We talked about rats and pipes.
We broke down the neuroscience of sleep deprivation and ambiguity aversion, watching as a tired mind was lured across the threshold by the malicious digital link of wet footprints, stepping right into a space where the history of past victims was literally archived in the plaster.
The epigraphy of the damned, essentially. We explored the terrifying philosophical concept of a gestalt entity that doesn't just kill its prey, but digests their identity.
Yeah, the stolen voice.
stealing a victim's unique vocal resonance to strip away their sense of self. We witnessed the total dissolution of Euclidean reality as a room turned into a coordinated predatory hive mind.
The Venus flytrap.
And finally, we unpacked that devastating existential twist. The realization that the protagonist hadn't just lost their physical life, but had their very ego replaced, screaming with a stranger's voice as they became the new heartbeat of Room 13.
It is a masterfully constructed nightmare that really changes how you look at the four walls around you.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with something I want you, the listener, to really mull over tonight as you try to fall asleep.
Well, this will be fun.
Think about the ambient noises in your own home tonight as you lie in bed. The sudden creaking of the floorboards out in the dark hallway, the sharp metallic ping of the settling pipes deep inside the drywall, the faint rhythmic tapping of a tree branch against your bedroom window glass.
All those normal sounds.
As we've extensively discussed today, your brain is hardwired by millions of years of evolution to rationalize those sounds. It will whisper to you that it's just the wind or just the house settling as the temperature drops because your brain desperately wants you to feel safe enough to close your eyes and rest.
It needs you to sleep.
But what if your brain is lying to you? What if one of those sounds isn't random architectural settling? What if it's a rhythmic, coordinated question? Carefully, patiently testing your curiosity in the dark, just waiting to see if you are tired enough or foolish enough to get out of bed, turn the handle, and answer.
A profoundly chilling thought to end on.
Truly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these incredibly eerie, paradigm-shifting sources. Keep your doors locked, ignore the knocking no matter how much you want the ambiguity to end, and we will see you next time.